Hey there YouTube, Baylor here, from the Cozy Standing Setup, here to talk today about the cards of the Defect. I'm going to be ranking all 75 cards on a scale from D to S, or S to D, I guess, however you want to interpret that, as a kind of general rating of how strong they are. A higher tier card being one that I tend to take more often when presented with it. If you find this video helpful, please do drop me a like below and let me know in the comments what your favorite Defect card is. What is the one card that you'll take all the time when presented with it, no matter what the other options are. Without further ado, let's start taking a look at the comments, starting with none other than the legendary Claw. Love it or hate it. It's a card with a lot of emotional impact for us. I tend to find that Claw is a little difficult to get good use out of. It really does need support in the form of big card draw or redraw like Hologram. And just on its own, particularly that first Claw, it's not exactly high. I gotta put it in C tier here, C for Claw. But it can definitely be a way to absolutely make a run mental. How about Leap? Leap's just nice, efficient block. It's, I think, probably somewhere between B and C tier. There's lots of good block cards on the Defect. Leap is simply an acceptable one. We'll put it down in C. Compile Driver. Compile Driver is a card draw card that doesn't need to be upgraded, is how I like to think about it. It's also half decent damage. The more orb types you have, potentially up to 4 different, the more cards it draws. I think overall probably around B tier. I really like Compile Driver, maybe even A tier actually. One of the two higher tiers here without being an S. I think it's pretty good. How about Beam Cell? This one's hard to rate. Beam Cell is the only source of vulnerable for the Defect. It's also very notably a zero-cost attack, which Defect has quite a few of. Those combo really nicely with, again, things like Hologram and All for One, the same stuff the Claw does, but it's a Claw that makes the enemy vulnerable. I think Beam Cell also straddles the A-B tier line. Maybe we'll put it up in A tier. I think it is really one of the best of Defect's attacks. That's also true of Barrage. 4 damage per orb that you have. Barrage can very easily scale, up to 10 hits if you have 10 orb slots, which is absolutely mental. If you have a capacitor or an inserter, or anything more than just the 3 orb slots that the Defect starts with, it gets really, really strong. And even early on, I think it can be a very good damage card. 12 or upgraded 18 damage. If you can just fill the 3 starting orbs. How about Cold Snap and Ball Lightning? I think these are both very, very similar cards, both common attacks that channel an orb. Ball Lightning is definitely the early game pick, one of the best things you can see on floor 1, and I think it remains a pretty solid pick throughout most of your run. Just a really good way to get a Lightning Orb down. Cold Snap is in a very similar boat. I think I might put Cold Snap 1 tier lower, just because there are many other better ways to get Frost Orbs, whereas that's not that true of Lightning, actually, I tend to find. How about Recursion? Poor Recursion. I think Recursion is a really cool card, notably has an upgrade to become 0 cost. But the base version of the card, 1 energy to just evoke an orb and channel a new orb with the same type. I tend to think of this as just another copy of Zap in the early game, which is not so bueno. I'd put unupgraded Recursion as D, and upgraded Recursion can be C or B depending on the deck. We'll settle on C tier overall. I don't think it's Defect's worst card by any means. Hologram gets a card from the discard pile. Hologram is one of the best manipulation cards the Defect has. I would almost consider putting Hologram up in S tier, but I don't think it's quite an always take. Which is what I'd broadly describe S tier as, almost always take. But Hologram is a very, very good card overall. It just gets you any card that you want to play again. There's so many different options, and the abundance of 0-cost cards on this character means that you can probably play the card for free too. Go for the Eyes. I like Go for the Eyes just about as much as Beam Cell, maybe a little bit less. I think I'll put it in the same tier though. Another 0-cost attack on the Defect with a very, very useful side effect, and notably a side effect that cannot be gained from any other source. Defect has no other weak cards. When it comes to dealing with the bosses of the late game, particularly if you're looking for a way for your Defect runs to not die to the Awakened one, I highly recommend Go for the Eyes as one card that you're going to include to help with that boss. That's the one. That boss always attacks, so the Weaken always applies, and they do very persistent damage, which means that the Weaken will make it a lot easier for you to block, particularly if you're blocking using powers. So give it a try. How do I feel about Cool-Headed? I don't know about Cool-Headed. Cool-Headed it's Frost and Draw, and that's a mighty good combo. The problem with Cool-Headed is that it's not a whole lot of numerical output, at least on the turn you play it. You know, just 2 block and 1 card draw. It's like a really sad shrug it off, kind of. But if you have focus, it becomes a really good Shrug It Off, or even a really good backflip when upgraded. So, I don't know, I think that's probably also in B tier. Can become an absolutely amazing, incredibly powerful card, but it's not always takeable because it doesn't do quite enough right away. That's how I feel. Probably put that in the same tier as the Cold Snap. I tend to think that those are the less good sources of frost. We'll be talking about some of the better ones shortly. Charge Battery. It's a lot of Blanc. I tend to think Battery is probably one tier higher than Leap. I like the secondary effect that it gives. It's essentially Leap plus 1 energy on the next turn minus 2 block. So you're paying 2 block to gain 1 energy next turn, which is a pretty good deal. I almost always prefer Charge Battery to Leap, and it can be a really nice staple for low energy decks. If you're heading into Act 2 with, say, an Empty Cage or a Runic Pyramid, Charge Battery might be your Defect's best friend. Defect in general finds it really, really easy to run very low energy decks, because Defect has a lot of cards that generate energy. Turbo is one such card, the only one in the common pool that does it, giving you 2 energy immediately and then putting a Void into the discard pile. That Void, when drawn, will cost you 1 energy, but simply being 2 energy for 0 is really dang good on Turbo. And I say it's probably one of the better energy generators for Defects, by virtue of being reusable. Not the best, and I think it's waned a little bit with recent balance patches, but well, not really recent, with a year ago balance patches, but it is still one of the better ways to gain energy on the Defect. Overall, I think the Defect has an incredibly, incredibly good pool of common cards. The best pool of commons for every character. It's why I recommend, if you're doing common sense, to use the Defect character. Do highly recommend using Defect as your achiever for common sense. The pool of commons is really, really good and does include notably some scaling cards. From Claw, you can also use Streamline as a source of scaling. This card gets cheaper when played. After being played 2 times, it's free. And that is shockingly powerful. I think I'm going to put Streamline in... I think it's a B tier card. My opinion on Streamline has gone up quite a bit recently, as I found that Streamline, particularly with an upgrade, can be an enormous amount of damage if combined with the manipulation cards of the Defect. That is Hologram particularly, but also Rebound. Putting a card back on top. Is Rebound A or B? I think Rebound is very, very good. Rebound to me feels like Defect's version of Headbutt. You can't choose any card in the discard pile, but you could if you had a hologram. You could also do really fancy things like rebound your hologram to get a card from the discard pile this turn, and then next turn you can rebound a card and then draw it again. You can rebound a card and then seek it. There are so many things you can do with Rebound that are really, really powerful and impressive. The fact that it does 9 upfront damage isn't bad either. I think I'll put it in B, but that's not because it's bad by any means. I think Rebound is an incredibly good card overall. But I don't think the same of Sweeping Beam. Sweeping Beam is probably the worst of Defect's area damage cards. There aren't a whole lot of those, but of them, Beam is probably the worst. Only 6 damage to every enemy. It's kind of piddly. The card really does need an upgrade to make it an even 9, but even then it doesn't feel like it's that good. I'd usually rather have one of the other options. However, Sweeping Beam, if you can enhance its power some way, say you've got Strength for any reason, it can be a lot better. Or if you have an abundance of energy, because it does draw a card, it can be pretty useful too. How do I feel about Steam Barrier? Steam Barrier is a 0-cost block. I do appreciate it for being a nice, cheap, playable block. My main issue with it, though, is that because it gets reduced in power every time you play it, the fact that it's 0 cost is diminished a little bit. It's not a very good hologram or rebound target, or all-for-one target, because it'll get very weak very quickly unless you're able to increase your dexterity significantly. Now, with dexterity, with particularly kunai, I think Steam Barrier becomes exceptional, but it's simply okay on its own. Defect's got plenty of good block cards, so Steam Barrier doesn't really feel like it has a huge role to play. Stack, I think, is such card, but has the potential to be the best of Defect's block cards. If you've got, 30 cards in your discard pile, that is 30 block for 1 energy, which is pretty incredible. In the early game, or if you draw Stack on turn 1, it can be a real downer, though. So Stack is a little bit unreliable, but combined with Retain or Manipulation, I think it becomes incredible. To that end, I'm going to put it in B tier. It's a card I don't take often enough, is how I feel about Stack. Really almost feels like it should be an uncommon card. But if you're hanging around in the late game, I think Stack is incredible overall. Nice kind of symmetrical ABC distribution here for the commons. I feel really good about that initial rating overall. I'm trying to think if have I rated S tier for any common on any character? I did rank Piercing Whale as S tier, and I think I stand by that. Yes, Piercing Whale is S tier. That makes sense. All right, let's talk uncommons. Speaking of S tier, I think we're gonna have our first here, Aggregate. I've mentioned that the Defect has a lot of energy generating cards. Well, I think Aggregate is the best energy generating card on a character with a lot of energy generating cards. 1 energy for every 4 or upgraded 3 cards in the draw pile. The reason Aggregate is so good is that unlike all of the other energy generators, it is both reusable and 0 downside. All of the other cards that generate energy either have some kind of disadvantage. Turbo gives you a void. Recycle requires you to exhaust a card, although that might be a good thing. Fusion doesn't give you the energy immediately. Or they exhaust, a la double energy. Aggregate is not only 0 downside, but with any decent number of cards in the draw pile, it can generate quite a lot of energy, more than Turbo does, usually. And potentially up to 10 plus if you can get a significant draw pile. And that can absolutely break the game wide open, allowing you to play pretty much as many cards as you want. To that end, Aggregate ends up with an S tier ranking from me. It's one of the only cards that I'll almost always take if offered, as long as I don't have a surplus of energy already. You still need to be able to spend the energy, of course. The more card draw you can get, the better Aggregate becomes, particularly because it lets you either spend all of the energy or it lets you reshuffle your draw piles so that Aggregate generates more energy, depending on when you drew it. As with all things, gets better with Retain. How about Auto Shields? I think Auto Shields is a little underrated overall. Doesn't quite feel like it belongs in A tier, but I'm going to put it up in B here. 11 block for 1 energy is really good. The only problem is that you have to have no block in order to play it, which means being aware of your card ordering, for one, and it also means not getting block from a draw effect, or from hologram, or from a looped frost orb at the start of your turn. The various boat relics can also make auto shields useless for you. But if you can get the block out of it, 11 or particularly upgraded 15 is heckin' sweet. How about Blizzard? Blizzard deals damage based on the number of frost orbs we've channeled so far during the combat. That is, it sounds better than it is how I feel about Blizzard. It's surprisingly difficult to channel more than a few Frost Orbs, and for Blizzard to deal more damage than, say, Sweeping Beam, you have to channel at least 4 Frost. That's 2 Glacier plays. And that's just comparing to unupgraded Sweeping Beam, you know? It really does take a lot of Frost Orbs channeled for Blizzard to be good. That said, Blizzard can be very good if you're able to channel many Frost Orbs. The big card that I think makes Blizzard good is Echo Form, allowing you to duplicate your Frost Orb generators. Blizzard, and actually most of all, Chill as a 0-cost multi-frost generator. Blizzard overall ends up as a, I think, relatively mediocre option. It can work as you're scaling. Particularly if you're all frost and focus, Blizzard can be a really good answer for late game bosses. I'm talking Time Eater, I'm talking Awakened One, I'm talking the Heart. Blizzard can be really good in those fights, but really struggles to provide the meaningful area of effect damage that you kind of want it to be able to do. And I think that makes it a little unfortunate. Boot Sequence, guaranteed turn 1 block. I think this card is one that I don't take quite often enough. I'm going to give it B for Boot. Boot Sequence. 10 block on turn 1. You almost always want one of these. Rarely do you want 2, though. The big problem with the Boot Sequence is that they take up those valuable turn 1 draws, when you'd often rather be drawing damage cards or power setup cards. But it does just a fine job. Speaking of a fine job, Bullseye also does a fine job, applying a lock-on debuff that makes your orbs do more damage, whether lightning or dark. This is also a status effect, so it can remove artifact charges to make your beam cell or go for the eyes apply something too. Does want an upgrade to make the lock-on last 1 turn longer usually, which limits it a little bit. I think overall maybe yet another B tier card. I like Bullseye just fine. B for Bullseye. Oh man, Capacitor is going to be kind of hard for me to rate here. It really depends. Orb slots are tricky with the Defect. Orbs are unequivocally good. You always want orbs. Orbs provide passive bonuses, or if you have enough orbs already, they just evoke, and you get an immediate bonus. But orb slots are simply the possibility to hold more orbs. Having more orb slots means you get less evokes. So for shorter fights, orb slots can actually be a detriment to you, and spending a card draw and energy on orb slots is shooting yourself in the foot, metaphorically speaking, a lot of the time. So in many combats, most of the hallway combats and many of the early game fights, Capacitor is an active detriment to the Defect, but once you're able to fill those orb slots and keep them that way with some focus, it can be an absolutely important, essential part of your late game. So Capacitor for me starts at like C or D tier and then quickly moves up to A or S depending on other parts of the run. It's really hard to give this one an overall ranking. I'll probably put it in B tier. It's about as good as Loop. You get one more orb slot, but you have to fill it, whereas Loop is just activate your passive one time. I think I'm going to put Loop in the same tier here with Capacitor. Not my favorite Defect powers. They're mid to late game specialists, I tend to think of them as. You really want to have focus before these cards end up being useful, but they're okay. They're absolutely okay, and they can be a S for situational, yeah. They can absolutely be a core part of your late game strategy. How about Chaos? Chaos channels random orbs. Upgraded its 2 orbs for the price of 1, which I think is pretty valuable. That's probably another B tier overall. I don't feel like Chaos is A tier. I definitely don't feel like Chaos is C tier. It's just okay. But we are going to get some A tier rankings here in a moment, because we're getting into some of the uncommons that I really do like. First of all, Chill. This is an enabler for Blizzard. It's also potentially multiple Frost Orbs for the price of 1, and has a really nice upgrade to be a turn 1 card, so that you always get 1 or more Frost Orbs on turn 1. For free. I really love Chill. Really love Chill in a lot of different situations. One of my favorite Frost generators. Doesn't need the upgrade, but is cool. Cool if you can. Really like it. My only problem with it, of course, is that it exhausts, so you can only use it one time, but that's mostly just an excuse to pick up another copy. How about Consume? I think Focus in general is one of the strongest things this Defect has access to. Consume has the awkwardness of being a 2-coster. As well as consuming your orb slots, which can be either a good or a bad thing. I'm tempted to put Consume up in A tier here. I don't want to have a million B tier cards. And I think I'm going to put Focus in general as very high tier, because it is so incredibly powerful for the Defect. So I'm going to put that up in A, I believe. That's also where Darkness is going to end up. Channel 1 Dark, the upgraded version of Darkness, also immediately activates the passive effect of all Dark Orbs. So if you've got any kind of focus, or if you've got multiple Dark Orbs, that becomes incredible, particularly with Hologram. Darkness is a absolute boss killer of a card, or of an orb type, period. Charging up damage over time to unleash it all at once with a dual cast or a multicast. I really like Darkness going into Hexaghost or Slime Boss in Act 1. It's also a really good way to kill the champ here in Act 2. Defrag. It's focus. It's focus without any condition or downside. I know that there are many players in the Defect players in the camp of see a defrag, take a defrag. I'm not quite 100% agreeing with that. If I truly believed in that, I would put it in S tier, but I don't quite feel that way. Defrag is good, definitely good, particularly with the upgrade for 2 focus, but it does need that upgrade to be really significant, and it's not the biggest impact card. 2 focus is good, but it doesn't single-handedly win fights. That said, almost all Defect runs are going to want 1 or more copies of Defrag to give them some focus. Doom and Gloom is a card that it took me a really long time to warm up to. It's area of effect damage and a Dark Orb stapled together into one weird card. At 2 cost, it really doesn't seem worth the price of admission for either the 10 AoE damage or the Dark Orb, but the key is you get both, and you're going to be able to use both. The other key to this card is that you always want what it has to offer. Dark Orbs are excellent against single targets, and the AoE damage aspect of it is great against multiple enemies. To add to that, it's one of the very few area of effect damage cards the Defect has, and has a really good upgrade of +4 damage to every enemy hit. All these things make Doom and Gloom an overall excellent card for me. Really love to see Doom and Gloom on the Defect. It's just, it ends up being a lot more damage than it seems like. Double Energy. Unfortunately, Double Energy, you're outclassed. This could be a really cool way to get energy, particularly if you have a lot of energy. For example, you have Ice Cream. Double Energy can be a spectacular way to get more energy. And if you can get multiple copies of Double Energy, it can be really breakable. One of my favorite ways to win with the Defect is 2 or 3 copies of Double Energy in a Tempest or a multicast. Just explode all that energy in an X-cost spectacular fashion. But ultimately, you'll probably have more luck with an aggregate or with a turbo. And so most of the time when I see double energy, I'm not that happy to see it. I'm going to give that a C tier. Equilibrium, another one of my favorites here. It's genuinely really good block. 13 upgraded to 16. That's about the same as Flame Barrier on Ironclad, or Protect on Watcher, but it also has the added benefit of letting you retain your entire hand for a turn, kind of like playing with Runic Pyramid. That's very good on Defect. Defect has a lot of cards that care about the order they get played in, or a lot of energy generating cards that you might want to hold on to for a future turn. That personally for me puts Equilibrium way up in A tier here. A really, really good block and a really, really good manipulation card. One of my favorites for sure. Force Field. Force Field is a weird one. It gets cheaper with every power you've played, which can bring it all the way down to 0 cost, allowing you to kind of hook into the 0 cost synergies of Defect, like Scrape and All for One and all that. If you've got a power-rich deck, Force Field becomes absolutely incredible. If you don't, it's pretty unpickable. Hard to give this one an overall rating. This is really, really specific to the deck, just kind of like Capacitor is. But I think overall, I'll put it in B tier. I like it more as a block card than I tend to like Steam Barrier. And if you can get your hands on multiple copies in the right deck, it can be a beautiful, beautiful thing. An easy way to block the heart if you can just play upgraded Force Field 2 or 3 times in the same turn. How about FTL? FTL is good. I tend to think of FTL as just kind of an early game, add some extra damage to my Defect. It's about the damage of a strike, but it also draws a card and costs 0, so it's essentially free. But that's only true as long as you're not playing a lot of cards on your turn. Once you start drawing many, many cards with skims or holograms or all-for-ones or compile drivers, then the FTL becomes just a mediocre card. But until that happens, it's great and can be just a really nice supplement, particularly in Act 1 and Act 2 is where I like it most. It can be a negative for you in the later game. I don't think it quite belongs in A tier, maybe in B tier though. I think it's quite fine. But it's never a huge impact, right? FTL's never making or breaking the deck. FTL's never something you're building around. It's just fine. Fusion. Fusion's a weird one. Gives you a Plasma Orb. Plasma Orb is energy every turn. Can enable compile drivers. Can be part of an infinite combo with recursion and a lot of card draw as well. But costs a lot of energy, right? It takes 2 turns for Fusion to pay for itself, or 1 turn if upgraded. Unless you can get it evoked quickly. I think that tends to put it in the lower tiers here, probably down in C tier. But am I going to rank D tier? Sure, I'll find something. I don't really think Defect has that many bad cards, quite frankly. We might not see any entries for the D tier here. Like a Flash of Steel that can't be used in infinites is a good description of FTL. But it does a little bit more damage, and that's quite notable. Algorithm, this is another fantastic one. Genetic Algorithm is a card that is very, very good overall. It starts out weak, but it quickly gets strong. It's just a 1-time per combat block. But because it becomes permanently stronger, it usually ends up being dang heckin' good. I won't put it up in S tier because I think there are absolutely times when you don't want to take Algorithm. Right before very dangerous combats is one of them, and towards the end of your run is the other. But if you see an Algorithm basically anywhere in Act 1 or Act 2, it's pretty dang good. The fact that it's not reusable is what keeps it out of S tier, but it's fantastic. Glacier, probably one of the better Frost generators. 7 block into 2 Frost. Put that way up in A tier. Glacier, Defrag are close friends. It's just dang heckin' good block, is what it is. Heat sinks. Dang heckin' good card draw is what I think of heat sinks. Card draw every time you play a power card. Depending on how many powers you have, that may or may not be incredible. One of my favorite things to do on Defect is heat sinks plus Mummified Hand and a deck full of powers and just play every single card in the deck all at once. That said, I don't often end up taking heat sinks because I don't often have enough powers in deck, but they can be really good. I think it's a solid B from me. What about Hello World? Hello World's another one that I struggle to rank. At the start of your turn, add a common card to your hand. We talked about how all the commons of Defect pretty much are good, and I think especially in the early game, a random common card added to your hand is very nice. Consider this a very good first pick for your Defect as a way to get past the elites of Act 1 or to get past your first boss. But it can still stay relevant in the late game. Note that Hello World can generate holograms to let you get cards out of the discard pile. Hello World can generate Frost Orbs for you via Cool-Headed or Cold Snap. And Hello World can generate Go for the Eyes to create Weak, or even just zero-cost block sometimes in the form of Steam Barrier. There's a lot of good hits from the Hello World. That said, it ends up becoming a dead burden to you later in your run, usually. And notably, the upgrade to it makes it innate, appearing on turn 1, which is, again, very good in the early game, but potentially detrimental in the late game. I almost want to just to split tier this one. This is A tier in Act 1 and C tier everywhere else. I could settle on B tier, but I think we have enough things in B tier. I'll drop it down to C, which is a little lower than it deserves. How about Melter? Melter's a pretty good attack. One of the better ones, I think. Does pretty dang good damage, 10 or upgraded 14, and the block removal is more helpful than you might think against numerous foes, particularly against the Spheric Guardian depicted right on the art. Just instantly dies to this card. That makes it pretty good. It's one of the better attacks, not quite A tier, but I think it belongs at the very least alongside Streamline. Overclock. Overclock's a tricky one. You get 2 draws for 0 cost 1 card, but you put a burn to the discard pile. So an unupgraded Overclock nets you 1 extra card, but then you have to redraw both the Overclock and the burn eventually, which means Overclock ends up being a net negative to your card draw over the long term. The purpose of this card is to let you get deployed a little bit faster. That's kind of like the whole theme, right? With overclocking your CPU, you go faster, but you overheat. So I really like the thematicness of it. That said, it's a really tough card to want. Almost demands the upgrade to make it draw 3. Otherwise, it's just not worth it. Can be quite good if you're able to get rid of the burns somehow. You can either recycle them or get rid of them with the medical kit. But overall, it's one of the worst options the Defect has for draw. C or maybe even D tier. I can't in good conscience put Overclock in D tier. I don't even know if Defect has D tier cards, as previously mentioned. I think it'll be just fine. It'd be kind of cool if I could separately rank the upgraded and unupgraded versions of each card. That would definitely then see quite a few things in the D tier. Recycle, one of my favorite energy generators on the Defect. I don't think it's quite A tier because Recycle on its own doesn't do anything. It gives you energy, sure, it exhausts the card, sure, but that doesn't create block or deal damage. You have to have other cards in your hand with which to do that, and that requires the support of some card draw. That is the big thing Recycle requires, is lots of card draw. If you have lots of card draw, Recycle is very, very good, and if you don't have lots of card draw, Recycle is not very good. Gets, of course, a lot better with the upgrade making it 0 cost, which makes it an excellent target for Hologram as a way to thin out your Defect decks. Notable that Recycle is the only way that Defect has to exhaust other cards and can be a very important component of assembling an infinite combo. But as previously stated, does need to be part of a rather complicated engine in order to really pop. How about a Reinforced Body? I think Reinforced Body is one of the best block cards the character has. 7 block, X times, with all of the... I almost want to put this as S tier, like the best block. In fact, I think I am going to put Reinforced up in S tier. It is the best block. Plain and simple. Here's some facts for you. Reinforced Body, played for 2 energy, blocks for more than all of the other 2 energy block cards in the game. 14 block for 2 energy, beats out Equilibrium, beats out Flame Barrier, beats out Glacier, beats out Protect, beats out... not Impervious, but Impervious exhausts. It's just more block. And that's still true if upgraded. 18 block for 2 energy. Add to that a character that can generate energy via a myriad of sources, and the fact that it's flexible, meaning you can block for a lot or a little, scales multiple times with any source of dexterity, be that the Oddly Smooth Stone, the Kunai, or Reprogram. It's just very, very flexible, and a card that scales really well. It's good in the early game and good in the late game. And I think for that reason, I'm going to put Reinforced Body all the way up in S tier. I think it's the best X-Cost card the Defect has, and I think the Defect puts their X-Cost cards to better use than most of the other characters. Hey everyone. Did you know that you can now support me directly on YouTube by getting a channel membership? For as low as $5 a month, you'll get access to perks like custom badges and emojis to use in comments and discounts on the merch store, all while helping support me and this channel to do what I love every day. Just click the join button below to get started. Now back to the video. Reprogram. Reprogram is, it's not quite a meme, but it's not as good as you want it to be. That's how I feel. For a very, very long time, this card was super maligned as a useless card on the Defect. But in its current incarnation, where you exchange focus in order to gain strength and dexterity, notably the upgraded version is 2 strength, 2 dexterity, Reprogram can be a way to scale your Defect run into the late game really, really well. That said, Reprogram needs a lot of support from other cards in order to be effective. I'm thinking specifically Hologram and Rebound to allow you to play it multiple times, but also block cards that can scale with it. Stuff like Steam Barrier, stuff like Reinforced Body. You'll note that a lot of the cards that work with the Reprogram are pretty high tier, but the Reprogram itself I don't think is very high tier. I'm going to put it down in C tier, unfortunately. That's because Reprogram is kind of a detriment at first. If you still have your starting Relic, then Reprogram is losing you damage from your Lightning Orb in exchange for the Strength. So a lot of the damage that you're gaining by playing your upgraded attack cards is being lost. Defect also doesn't have a lot of cards that scale very well with Strength, and the one that does the best is Barrage, which you don't want to lose your focus if you've got. Although there are some kind of cool things you can do with, say, Barrage, a whole bunch of Fusion Orbs, and a Reprogram. But when Reprogram does work, as mentioned, it's with multiple holograms, it's with multiple rebounds, and it's with zero-cost attacks, like Beam Cell, Go for the Eyes, or an All-for-One to get stuff back. D tier for me is almost never take, and I actually don't know if the Defect has any D tier cards. Something I've said a few times. I might put Thunderstrike in there. We'll see if there's going to be one. I'm also... I don't think Rip and Tear belongs in D tier either. I think Rip and Tear does end up being one of the worst attacks on Defect, although it provides really efficient damage. 14 damage for 1 energy or upgraded 18. Problem with Rip and Tear is the random targeting is problematic, because the fights that Defect most wants a deal 14 or deal 18 card in are the fights where you have multiple enemies. You want this card to get, you want that damage against Slavers, you want that damage against Spear and Shield, you want that damage against Gremlins. And if you can't target the damage in those fights, it doesn't do anything for you. That said, Rip and Tear can be just fine as an answer to Gremlin Knob, or as just a raw output card, and it can scale pretty reasonably with the Reprogram card. I'm going to put it in C tier, but I think you could make a reasonable argument for B tier too. Yeah, on not spikers, indeed. Scrape is another card that I think I previously would have put in D tier, and I think I still could, but I have to give Scrape some respect. I think it's C or even honestly B tier. And here are the reasons why. Scrape says draw 4 cards on it. You only get to keep cards if they're 0 cost, which can be really problematic. But draw 4 and potentially keep some of them is a dang useful effect, especially if you have a well-curated set of cards for Scrape to draw. Because it puts the cards into your discard pile, you can use a hologram to retrieve them, so it can act as a pseudo-draw in that way. And it can also be used to reshuffle your deck at key moments. Lastly but not leastly, Scrape can put more cards into your discard pile so that Stack blocks well. So Scrape and Stack go really well together. If I'm not going to put Scrape in D tier, what am I going to put there? I don't know. How about Self-Repair? I've come to rely on Self-Repair less and less the more Defect I play. I think it's easier to prevent the damage in the first place than it is to recover it with this card a lot of the time. But Self-Repair is still a really nice sustain piece on the Defect. I think that it becomes a card you do not want to take at the end of your run, so not something to take at the end of Act 3, because you need to have a lot of combats in order for Self-Repair to do any number of healing to you. But picked up early in Act 1, or better yet, in Act 2, it can be a really nice way to keep your health total high, so that your Defect can take damage in combats without losing outright from being bled to death. It works out okay. Skim. Unconditional draw 3, upgraded draw 4 on a character that has a lot of energy generation. Unconditional draw is incredibly good. I think Scrape is A, could even maybe be S tier, but I think Scrape is going to be A tier for me. Only problem with Scrape is that you need to have the energy generation already before it's particularly good. But, you know, add a turbo, add an aggregate, add a recycle, add 1 or 2 zero-cost cards, any of that. And Skim becomes incredible. Okay, we're down to the nitty-gritty here. Just a few more cards to rate. Static Discharge, a personal favorite of mine. I think this card is just really, really cool in what it does. Channeling Lightning Orbs whenever you're damaged. It's a 1-card solution for a number of fights. Hexaghost, Book of Stabbing, and most importantly of all, it works very, very well against the multi-attacks of Heart. The particularly cool thing you can do with Static Discharge is that if the new Lightning Orbs you get evoke a Frost Orb that you had, then you get that block immediately and it can prevent the next hit from a multi-attack that's headed your way. So Static Discharge, even though it generates Lightning Orbs, can create block for your turn. It's kind of fascinating like that. Now, it does require you to take damage in order to work, which does make it a little bit awkward, but the effect is so dang powerful that I think that it ends up as an A-tier card. I almost always want one of these on a Defect run, and I think I don't take it quite as often as I should. But overall, a very powerful and quite flexible card that I think people should try more often. Storm. 1 Lightning Orb per power card you play. Storm can be a really cool card to build essentially a whole deck around. Combos really well with Heat Sinks, giving you more draw for every power you play, and of course combos with just having a lot of powers in general. I think the big weakness of Storm, truly, is the Awakened one. That boss at the end of Act 3. If you're playing on Ascension 20, there's a high chance of encountering Awakened one. And it can be a real showstopper. But if you're playing on anything less than A20, I think Storm is A or maybe even sometimes S tier. If you're playing on A20 though, as I do all the time, I think it's down in B. Still very, very good. Can be an absolute ton of damage for 1 card played. If you've got a power-heavy deck, it's cool. Trap that Fluctuation loves falling into, I believe it. I believe it. It's a trap I love falling into, too. It's just dang cool when it works. Storm works particularly well with renewable sources of powers, such as Creative AI, or if you can duplicate Storm, you're going to have a good time. 1 Storm is okay, but you get 2 or 3 Storms in play, you're going to have a good time. Sunder. Sunder is probably one of my favorite attack cards on the Defect. I think this is going up in A tier here. It's just a ton of damage. 24 upgraded 32, and you get to refund the cost if it kills an enemy. Combo with Beam Cell or with Hologram, it's a great answer to small targets like Gremlins, like Reptomancer Daggers, or just a good finisher for any reasonably chunky target. One of the really cool things that Sunder can do, if you have Snecko Eye, or if you can discount the Sunder in any other way, a kill still refunds 3 energy, even if you didn't pay 3 energy for the Sunder in the first place. So it can become an energy generator if discounted via all sorts of things. Madness, Enlightenment, Snecko Eye, you name it. Tempest. Channeling X Lightning. I have a middling opinion of Tempest. Often only, quote-unquote, only 1 zap per energy that you spend on it. You can upgrade it to get 1 extra Lightning Orb, but ultimately you're not getting a whole lot of value per energy with the Tempest. For example, if you draw Tempest and Ball Lightning, you'd rather play the Ball Lightning and then spend any remaining energy on the Tempest. But if you can get a lot of energy, you know, if you're talking 10 plus energy, Tempest can be an absolute slapper. And also combos really well with any source of focus. It's not an always take for me, but it's definitely a take in the right moments kind of card. Take with energy generators, take with focus, but don't take otherwise. That's how I feel. I'm going to put that in B. There's definitely lots of uses, but it does sometimes fall short. And as noted, only a one-time use as well, which can be a bit of a detriment. One of the traps that is kind of easy to fall into on Defect is making a deck that runs out of fuel because all of your damaging cards either exhaust or their powers, so they don't get back in play. So you have like Storm and Tempest, you channel 10, 20 Lightning Orbs, and then you're done. You got nothing left. White Noise. White Noise is a card I've come around more and more and more on. Almost would put it in A tier, but I think is a solid A-B straddler these days. A random power card can be exactly the thing you need it when you need it. but it could also be exactly the thing you don't need. Sometimes it's just going to betray you with a Hello World or something else. One thing we noted recently on stream about White Noise is that it generates a power that is free this turn. Because Defect has no zero-cost powers, you're always getting a card that's at least 1 energy discount, and it may be a 2 or 3 energy discount. There's lots of big expensive powers on the Defect. Echo Form, Creative AI, Electrodynamics. If you get any of these from your White Noise, you're going to be feeling pretty good. Alright, on to the rares here. I think Defect has a pretty dang cool rare pool overall. Starting with All for One. All for One returns every zero-cost card from the discard pile to your hand. There are a lot of zero-cost cards on this character, and quite a few that can be made into zero-cost. Definitely a card you can build a deck around. Not one that I always take, though. I think I'm going to be putting it in B with the rest of the everything. Really good with multiple copies of Claw, really good with Beam Cells and Go for the Eyes. Good with upgraded Recycle. Just to name a few. You can get really, really creative with All for One. Especially if you get colorless cards involved. How many White Noises is too many? I would say, honestly, they probably get better in multiples. With storms and heat sinks and such, more powers are likely to be better. But there is such a thing as too many powers, so that can be a problem. Generally speaking, I'm pretty happy with 2 at a minimum. Alright, I think I have to put something in D tier, and if it's going to be anything, it's going to be this card right here. Thunderstrike. Thunderstrike is a very cool card in theory. You strike once per lightning orb that you've channeled. Now, at 3 cost, it's a pretty expensive card to play. And because of the way it works, it requires a lot of setup. That makes it extremely awkward at the best of times. And what I tend to find is that most of the time, very much a win more card. Most of the time, if Thunderstrike is doing reasonable amounts of damage, it means that you've channeled so many lightning orbs that your target is already dead. Or you can't afford to play it. Those are usually the two possibilities. That said, Thunderstrike can be incredible under very specific circumstances, usually involving Snekowai, but it could also involve like a really big double energy Tempest on 1 turn that channels 20 or 30 lightning orbs. One other use that I find for Thunderstrike is if comboed with Static Discharge, you can use it as a way to kill the heart. Because you take 1 multi-attack from the heart, channel 15 or 30 lightning orbs, and then your Thunderstrike hits super hard, but as previously mentioned, you've already done 1,000,000 damage with the lightning orbs at that point. And that's where Thunderstrike ends up really falling behind. It's just too much setup and too much price, and too rare for this card to be reasonably takeable most of the time. That said, I encourage you to find opportunities to take and use Thunderstrike, because it is really cool when it works. How about Meteor Strike, the other rare strike card? Meteor Strike is 24 damage and 3 Plasma Orbs. If you can play Meteor Strike, it's obscene. If you can't, don't worry, you're not alone. It's a 5-cost card that's really hard to play. I think I have to put it in B tier ultimately. It's far from terrible. Absolutely mental with Snekowai. Absolutely mental with Runic Pyramid. But it's just hard to play. It's just really hard to play. Down to just the last row of cards here. Seek. I think it's time for a new entry in S. S is for Seek. Seek at 0 cost lets you put any card from your draw pile into your hand. It's the ultimate consistency card. Always get the big power you need on turn 1. Always get the block card that you need when you need it. Always get whatever it is that you want. And where it gets really wild is if you have multiple upgraded copies of Seek, you can seek for more and more and more cards because one Seek can seek the other Seeks, and, well, it gets out of control from there. Some of the strongest defects I've ever had involved multiple copies of Seek and just kind of playing all of the best cards in the deck on turn 1. Yeah, it's as good as the best card in your deck, essentially. The only problem with Seek is sometimes you draw it with nothing in your draw pile, but that's such a rare occurrence, and even then it's usually pretty good overall. It's incredible. Seek is a very, very busted card, and is an almost always take for me because of that. How about Multicast? The last of the X-cost cards. Evoke your next orb X times, X+1 with the upgrade. Multicast is a card I've waffled a little bit on. I think it's really good if you've got Dark Orbs. And it can be okay with focus, but it's often hard to get the right combination of energy and focus that you need for Multicast to be particularly incredible. And that makes it really struggle for me. Probably a B, or let's put it down in C tier, honestly. That's probably where I'm going to put it, is down in C. That said, it can absolutely be a run winner with Retain in particular. I really love multicast, especially on Runic Pyramid runs, where I can always line up a Super Dark Orb. You can also use it as a crude double energy with Plasma Orbs, which can be particularly entertaining. All right, just a few more rares here. Let's take a look at some powers. Machine Learning. I think this is a bit of an underrated card on the Defect. Just one card every turn unconditionally. That's a lot of card draw, and as noted, this character makes exceptional use of card draw. It's also a one-cost power, which gives Defect the opportunity to combo with other stuff like Storm or Heat Sinks for immediate draw. Overall, I think Machine Learning ends up in an A tier for me. I really do like it. Often I'll end up taking a better rare in many situations, but it's definitely takeable. Fission. Another card draw card. Tend to like these a lot on Defect. Fission does require that you have orb generation to work, though. More problematically, it gets rid of your orbs, although with the upgrade, it evokes them instead, which can be a pretty good thing. You get the immediate numerical value of them, as well as drawing a bunch of cards, gaining a bunch of energy. It's kind of like a mini offering. I would put Fission somewhere between A or B. I think I'll put it up in A here, as something I'm really happy to have, as long as I have orbs. If I don't have orbs, though, it's a no-no. That's a no-no. Bias Cognition. I've heard a couple exclamations to the effect of, how come Defrag's not an S tier card? And the answer is because Bias Cognition is the S tier focus card, for sure. Bias Cognition is way more focused than Defrag. Yes, you do lose one focus per turn, and that can be a problem, but consider that it takes 3 or 4 turns to fall to the point of the Defrag, and consider that there are numerous ways to negate that penalty entirely with Bias Cognition. You can do this by having an artifact charge, you could do this by removing the debuff with orange pellets. Or a lot of the time, you can simply win the fight in 3 or 4 turns because you have so much dang focus. That's usually what I prefer to do with Bias Cognition. Simply upgrade Biased and play it a couple of times, and you won't care that you're losing 2 focus per turn, because everything is going to be dead very quickly. And I've had many successful Defect runs that were off the back of a couple of Bias Cogs, and I didn't even find a way to negate their penalty. It was enough. Now, if you do negate the penalty, you're going to be in very good times. Echo Form is another very incredible Defect power, letting you duplicate the first card that you play each turn. The big thing that Defect likes to use this for is multiplying their focus cards, scaling up by duplicating the first power you play each turn. However, Echo Form is a 3-cost card and notably doesn't give you any benefit until the turn after you play it. I think for me that personally keeps it out of the S tier. It's not an always take, and I've noted Defect runs where the Echo Form has ultimately ended up hurting us. It's definitely one of those powers that can end up being a trap, because you have to invest so much into it for it to give you anything. That said, as the conqueror of the Defect's late game, it's hard for me to give Echo Form anything lower than an A, but I'm very happy to put it in A tier here. It's just too expensive for me to justifiably put an S. How about Hyper Beam? Hyper Beam is an incredible, particularly on low Ascension, Hyper Beam is an incredible front-load card for the Defect. It's the ultimate end those short, dangerous encounters instantly card. Kill all the slavers, kill all the gremlins, kill the spikers, all in one devastating blow. Problem is it costs a lot of focus, and that's pretty hard to justify. But I think the sheer output that it provides can make it worth it as a occasional answer to things. I'm struggling between A and B tier here. I'll put it up in A. I think Hyper Beam is pretty dang good. Very good with Snecko Eye, very good with being able to play it multiple times via a hologram or something. Consider it as a card you'll only play in maybe a third of fights, but in those fights that you play it in, it's incredibly good. Yeah, get out of Act 1 or 2 card. And by having the Hyper Beam, you can avoid needing to include other front-loaded damage cards. So including one Hyper Beam means not having to take a Streamline and a Compile Driver, or not having to take a Sunder and a Beam Cell. Although you should take the Beam Cell if you have a Hyper Beam. Could also be donated to the Bonfire Spirits later in the run, or otherwise removed, but having it as a card that you don't play in the late game is okay if it was a card that you did play in the mid game. That's how I feel about Hyper Beam. One of the better AoE answers, along with Electro, which I'm also going to put up in A tier. Electro is a pretty dang powerful card, making your Lightning Orbs hit all enemies. It also channels Lightning Orbs up front. It's a really good way to deal with any multi-enemy fight, particularly if you're an orb-heavy defect. My main beef with Electrodynamics is that it really doesn't do anything in fights where there aren't multiple enemies. Notably, the Heart is an enemy that I don't like having Electro going into. But also Time Eater and some of the beefier opponents of Act 3, like the Giant Head, can really punish you for having an Electrodynamics in your deck. That said, it's a dang good card, and an almost always include for me. Alright, we're getting down to brass tacks here, just a few left. Creative AI, a card that my opinion has improved on substantially. I like this as a one-card solution for the late game. Just like Hyper Beam is a one-card solution for the mid and early game, Creative AI can be a one-card solution for your boss fights. Although it's an extremely expensive card. You have to pay 3 energy for the Creative AI, but then also pay for every subsequent power generated, meaning Creative AI is a kind of ongoing energy investment. That said, it's unlimited scaling. All the capacitors, loops, defrags, static discharges, storms, and heat sinks you could ever shake a stick at. Big thing to note, you cannot get self-repair from Creative AI, so don't expect it. Problem is also that it's random, so you're not guaranteed to get anything that you might want. Definitely works better in situations where you don't care what power you're getting because you have, say, Mummified Hand or Storm. Notably, Creative AI is incredibly good with the Bird-Faced Urn Relic because then you'll heal for every power that you play. Alright, Reboot. I think Reboot is one of the less good card draw cards. Definitely less good than Fission overall. But don't sneeze at draw 4. Reboot puts all of your cards back into the draw pile. That means if there's any powers you were looking for, they're probably further away than they were. But Reboot can be really good if you're playing a deck that just wants to play a lot of cards. If you're able to empty your hand before playing Reboot, then it can be incredible. Or if you're looking to redraw a Streamline or copies of Claw, Reboot can be a really good way to do that. The other thing to note is that upgraded Reboot is very good, going from a draw 4 to a draw 6. And there are only a couple of cards in the game that upgrade for 2 additional cards drawn. So consider the upgraded version of Reboot to be A tier. However, it's often difficult to justify the upgrade. Buffer. Blocks 1 or 2 big hits. Well, 1 or 2 instances of damage. Buffer can be an absolutely incredible way to buy your defect turns with which to scale. Makes it incredibly useful against all sorts of hard-hitting opponents, but particularly those in Act 3 and Act 4, when the game throws some serious damage hits at you. The big attacks of the Hearts, Transient, Giant Head, Time Eater. Against all of these foes, Buffer is great, and if you can duplicate Buffer getting 2 or 4 stacks, you're going to have a really good time, basically no matter who you're fighting. That said, Buffer needs support to work. You have to have some control over when you play it, and you have to have some amount of block so that you can preserve your buffers for the hits that matter, and that keeps it out of S tier. It's not always unilaterally useful, it's definitely not always the best rare card, but it's a really good one and one of the best defensive options the character has. Core Surge, it's a source of artifact, also does nice upfront damage, 11 damage. The artifact of Core Surge is useful for blocking primarily focus down effects on the defect, most notably Bias Cognition, but it also works on Hyper Beam and also on Reprogram, so don't disregard it there. And that's without counting all of the different enemy effects that Core Surge can stop, such as the entangling effect of the Spire Growth or the Hex of the Chosen. I guarantee you if you take a Core Surge, you'll find a good use for that artifact. Lastly but not leastly, don't forget potions too. Speed Potion or a Flex Potion combined with an artifact gives you 5 permanent strength or dexterity, and that can be a really good way to win a boss fight too. Overall, Core Surge is flexible. That's one of the key things when it comes to being a really good card, I think, in Slay the Spire, is flexibility. Part of why Seek is so dang good. Every fight in the Spire requires a slightly different performance from your deck, and so cards that can alter their performance are going to be really good. Amplify. Speaking of cards that are not flexible, here's Amplify. Amplify duplicates 1 power or 2 if upgraded. Big problem with Amplify is multifold. 1, you have to draw it in the same hand as your powers. 2, this card does not exhaust, but your powers do, so eventually you'll run out of powers and you only have Amplify left. That is a little awkward. That said, if you can duplicate loops, capacitors, defragments, bias cognitions, Amplify can be okay. I think it's best with... Actually, I'm probably put that down in C tier, actually, thinking about it more. It's not a D tier card. It's not a D tier card. Works pretty well with Creative AI. Works pretty well with Storm. In general, wants card draw support. So particularly good with Seek, with Equilibrium, or with just lots of draw in general. Pretty good with Mummified Hand as well. But it does need a lot of support. I have seen Defect runs that win with just 1 copy of Amplify, and then like 1 defrag, 1 capacitor, and 1 loop. If you're able to duplicate all of those powers, you've got scaling. Yeah, Amplify is sick when it works. The problem with Amplify, most of the time, it does not work. Centennier asks, if you have 2 Echo Forms and play Amplify, do you get 3 plays of the next power? Yes, the Amplify gets played twice, and then you have 1 Echo Form and Amplify queued up. So if you play a power immediately, you'll get 3 copies of that. You'll also then have 1 or more stacks of Amplify left, so you continue to get double for subsequent powers played on that turn. As noted, Amplify, very good with Runic Pyramid, but then again, what Defect card isn't, you know? Alright, the last, but certainly not least, Rainbow. It's one of my favorite orb generators, truthfully. 3 orbs for the price of 2, I like to think of this. 1 card, 3 orbs, 2 cost. It's only a single use, but you could upgrade it to get it to be used multiple times. I tend to think of it as a B tier overall. It's just relatively efficient. Like Doom and Gloom, I think that Rainbow is always giving you something that you want, because either you want damage or you want a Frost Orb, and Rainbow gives you both of those things at the same time. Rainbow can also be a nice card for the late game. If you've got lots of focus, then simply spamming Rainbow and just getting as many orbs onto the field as possible can be a way to win. So I've certainly had defects that have won off the back of echo forming the rainbow with 8 or 10 points of focus. You just spam so many orbs that you win. All right, that's every single defect card ranked from S to D. Until next time, toodaloo. Thanks for tuning in. Hey there. If you enjoyed that video, watch this one next. And before you go, join us on Twitch and watch live. I'm there 5 days a week playing Slay the Spire, answering questions, and chilling with the community. Click the link in the description to follow right now. Ta-ta for now.